Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Firstly, a thank you to the sponsors for today's class and lunch. Joanne Cohn is sponsoring in the memory of her husband, Laser Cohn. He should have a lichtige Gan Eden. He should watch down upon the entire family and see to it that everyone is blessed with all of their needs. It's also sponsored by Jeff and Lori Goldschin. It's sponsored in honor of the upcoming marriage of David and Lior. This is David and Marcia Weingarten's son, a Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. They should only have many, many simchas. A reminder that on Monday, February 12th, we have Professor Jody Magnus joining us. She's one of the leading archaeologists in the world today, and she spent quite a lot of time on top of Masada. She's written a book about Masada. The title of her book is the title of the lecture, Masada from Jewish Revolt to Modern Myth. It's Monday, February 12th at 8 p.m. It's a lecture that is sponsored by Mount Sinai Memorial Parks and Mortuaries, a grant that they gave us to have educational lectures such as this. I encourage you to make your reservations early, as it is filling up fast and it will be a complete sellout. So please, if you'd like to hear one of the leading archaeologists of the world today speak about Masada, when you finish class today, you can either sign up with Jacob or go on jewishacademy.com and make your reservations to join us. I'd like to begin today with a little bit on Israel and then get right back to where we left off on the subject of prophecies. A little bit of those that were in Shul this past Shabbos, some of it is what I spoke about in Shul, so you'll hear a little bit of a repeat. But it was a difficult week last week, as we lost many soldiers, sadly and unfortunately and tragically. And one of the soldiers that lost their lives last week was a 35-year-old father of 4 children, a twin brother, a rabbi himself. And many of the soldiers, when they go out to battle, they leave behind a letter. And the letter is only to be opened in the event that they don't come home. And this particular soldier left a letter, Elkanah Wiesel. And I want to read to you from his letter in memory of Elkanah and in praise of Elkanah, and for us to feel some inspiration and gratitude towards the modern day Maccabees of the IDF. He writes, "If you are reading these words, something must have happened to me. First of all, in the event that I get kidnapped, I demand that you refrain from making any deals for the release of any terrorists in order to release me. Our overwhelming victory is more important than anything, so please just continue to act with all of your might so that our victory is as overwhelming as possible. Maybe I fell in battle. And when a soldier falls in battle, it's sad. But I ask you to be happy. Don't be sad when you part with me. Sing a lot, hold each other's hands, and support each other. We have so much of what to be proud of and happy about. We are the generation of redemption. We write the most significant moments in the history of our nation and of the entire world. So please be optimistic. Keep choosing life all the time. A life of love, a life of hope, a life of purity, a life of optimism. Look at your loved ones in the whites of your eyes and remind them that everything they go through in this life is worth it. And they have a lot to live for. Live. Don't stop the energies of life for a moment. I was injured during the 2014 Gaza war. And therefore, I had the choice to stay behind. But I don't regret for a moment that I went back to be a fighter for Israel. On the contrary, it's the best decision I ever made. That's powerful words. Someone who was told by the army that you don't have to come in because you were injured in the last battle, and yet says, no, I'm going. And writes this letter to his family, and in essence writes this letter to all of us, to Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people. He writes a letter to Jewish history. He's writing a letter literally to make a statement that this is a generation that has seen the greatest of miracles of Jewish history, the return of Eretz Yisrael, in our hands. So we have to recognize and appreciate what we have, how far we've come. And therefore he asks us not to be sad for him, but to be happy for him that he had this opportunity. I don't know that any of us can listen to his instructions and not be sad. I don't know that we can read this and say, okay, I won't be sad, I'll be happy, because that's what Elkanah asked of us. Because there is sadness and there are tears. But at the same time, there is such a powerful message that Elkanah is giving forth to each and every single one of us, for us to truly appreciate who the martyrs of today are, who these heroes of our history are. You know, I mentioned this before, that for thousands of years we talk about the Maccabees, and we talk about how great the Maccabees are, and the role that they played in Jewish history. Every member of the IDF is as holy as the Maccabees of the story of Hanukkah. And that so many of them opted for this, chose to go to the front lines and be there to defend Israel, to defend the security of Israel and the survival of Israel. There was an interview on the radio in Israel with Yaron Or. Yaron Or is the father of one of the hostages. His son's name is Avi Natan. And in this interview, the interviewer asked Yaron the question that we all ask them, and that is, how do you survive? How do you go on each and every single day? We could not imagine what it's like to go on for 1 hour with a child being held hostage by Hamas, let alone a day, a week, a month, 100 days, 110 days and counting. The grief and the anguish and the anxiety is beyond anything that a human being is programmed to be able to survive. So this question was posed to Yaron Or. And Yaron said in his response that he gets his inspiration from the life of Nathan Sharansky. That Sharansky is an individual that he gets his inspiration from. Most of you, I believe, know who Natan Sharansky is. Natan Sharansky was a Soviet refusenik. He was imprisoned by the Soviet Union for quite a few years, with trumped-up charges of being a spy for Israel, which he was not. It was only because he put in immigration papers to make Aliyah. And for that, he was arrested the evening of his wedding. Literally right after he married his wife Avital, the KGB was waiting for him and took him away. And he became this symbol throughout the world of the battle for Soviet Jewry. Those of you that remember the 70s and the marches, whether they were in Washington or at American consulates all over the world or Russian, Soviet consulates, it was with posters of Free Natan Sharansky. He then went by his Russian name Anatoly Sharansky, and then later on he changed his name to Natan. His wife, Avital Sharansky, became a hero throughout the world. A very popular woman who was the shyest person, who would never looked for the limelight, and yet here realized that her husband's life is in her hands. And she has to travel the world and bring about awareness to the plight of her husband and the plight of the others that are suffering there. So much so that she made her way into Washington, D.C., made her way into the offices of many powerful senators and members of the House, spoke before the House and Senate, spoke at every single rally, and then made her way into the Oval Office. She had a meeting with Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time. And Reagan was so moved to tears. It's written up, those that were in the room at the time said they never saw the president so emotional, that he made a promise to Avital, I will not rest until your husband is freed. He made a promise, an oath to her. One of the upcoming summits that took place, there was a summit between Reagan and Gorbachev at the time. And as the limousine of the president and Gorbachev passed a particular corner, there was Avital Sharansky standing with a poster of her husband. Reagan had arranged for the chauffeur for the presidential limousine to pass this particular corner and to slow down as it reached this corner. And he says to Gorbachev, there will never be a relationship between our two countries that we dreamed of, so long as that woman is still standing on the street corner holding a poster of her husband. So do you want to know how we get our treaties? Her husband comes home. He kept his promise. And soon thereafter, Gorbachev gave the order for Sharansky to be released. Sharansky made his way to Israel, became a popular political figure in Israel, at some point had a political party, gave up politics, then didn't feel that it was for him, but speaks in many times and gives a lot of lectures and writes books. I say all of this as a background to this interview of Yaron Or saying, I get my inspiration from Sharansky, because he too was held hostage for such a long time, and he kept his faith throughout. Sharansky, of all people, is listening to this interview on the radio as Yaron is talking about him. So he immediately lets his staff know, I need to speak to Yaron. So now Sharansky is calling the father of this hostage, and they're sharing a discussion. And this is what Sharansky tells Yaron. It's a very powerful message. He says, when I was taken in and went through all the suffering and the exiles and the tortures, there were three things that kept me going. Three things. And that's why I was able to survive it. Number one was my wife. I knew that Avital would not stop until I was freed. And just knowing that there's another human being that's thinking about you at all times gives you the strength to survive. I knew my wife, I knew what she was doing, and that gave me strength. That gave me chizuk. My faith was strengthened each and every day just thinking about my wife. Number two was Klal Yisrael. Knowing that the Jewish people who I never met, people I never saw, were praying for me every day, gave me so much strength. So when I heard that everyone out there in the world knows my name, it wasn't the fame that did anything for me. It was the fact that they were praying for me, that I was part of their existence, part of their lives, that gave me strength. Number three. Right when I was taken away, my wife handed me a gift. That was my wedding gift. It was a book of Tehillim, a book of Psalms written by King David. That was the gift my wife gave me. I was able to take that along with me. Now understand, I was a secular Jew that never learned how to read Hebrew. So I taught myself Hebrew while in prison. I found a way to learn the Hebrew alphabet. I found a way to learn the meaning, and I found the way to read that book of Tehillim and to understand what King David was saying. I had years. This is what I did all day. And I started to imagine that King David was writing me letters every day. So as I read his psalm, I personalized it. He wrote this to me. Yes, he lived thousands of years ago, but he was writing me a letter. Every psalm I read was King David talking to me. That Tehillim kept me alive. That relationship with this book and those prayers kept me alive. There was an occasion during Sharansky's imprisonment that the Soviet guards took away this Tehillim from him. They saw how much strength it was giving him, and they didn't like that. They took it away. Sharansky went on a hunger strike. He refused to eat or drink until they returned his Tehillim. Gorbachev did not want Sharansky dying in prison because that would not look good. And so he ordered that the Tehillim be given back to him. When Sharansky was finally given the news that Gorbachev and Reagan reached an agreement and he was being freed, and he was being taken now out of prison and brought to a particular bridge where there would be this exchange between the Soviets and the Americans, and he would be passed on, they let him out of prison. They took him outside the prison, and as he was boarding, I'm not sure if it was a helicopter, whatever means of transportation, they took his Tehillim away from him. And they said, this doesn't go with you. Sharansky lay down on the floor. As he writes in his book, it was all snowy. He laid down in the snow. And he said, I will not budge from here without that book. This man was freed after years. He would not leave. Give me back my Tehillim. And again, word came that there's some delay in this major exchange that was supposed to take place on this bridge. Why is the delay? Sharansky's not moving. Why? Because they took away his Tehillim. The order was given again from above. Give him back that Tehillim. This is all part of the conversation that Sharansky is having now with Yaron Or, whose son is being held hostage. And then he tells him this. He says, but the last years of my imprisonment, of being held, quote unquote, as a hostage by the Soviets, things started changing in my mind. Whereas, as I told you, these three things were giving me strength, something changed. Where I started to realize that I was giving my wife strength by holding on. I was giving Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, strength by holding on. And I was actually giving strength to King David, for him in heaven knowing how much his psalms meant to me. It lifted his spirits. And it suddenly reversed that the strength that I have here in prison is giving strength to all of Israel. And that's what brought me to the finish line. Your son being held hostage, holding on, merely holding on, is giving strength to all of the Jewish people throughout the world. To hold on to this hope, to hold on to this faith, that indeed that day will come, and may it be today, that they are all reunited and brought back to their families and to the Jewish people. I want to close this segment and then get back to Deuteronomy with one more short story of another soldier. His name was Noam Ramati. He was serving in a battalion in the Gaza and sent on a critical mission. The mission lasted for many hours, from the middle of the night through the next night. They couldn't move wherever it is they was. They had to stay in their positions. Noam Ramati was a religious Jew, is a religious Jew. He never missed putting on his tefillin since the day of his bar mitzvah. But that day he could not put on tefillin. He was positioned and stationed in a place where he could not leave and could not move and could not get to his tefillin. It was the first time in his life that he didn't put on tefillin. The next morning, every member of his battalion knew how much this was on his mind, lined up before Noam, and they said, we know how much it disturbed you yesterday that you couldn't put on tefillin. So each of us would like the honor of you putting on tefillin with us to compensate for the fact that yesterday you didn't put on tefillin. This is a brotherhood, it's a sisterhood of people, of heroes. Every single member of this IDF, they're all holy. Whether they're religious, whether they're secular, it makes absolutely no difference. These are the holy of the holies. And they're out there for us, literally for us and for Jewish history, every single day, every hour, every minute. Every time we pray, that we have a moment to pray, please keep them in mind, keep them in your prayers. We were talking last week about prophecy, and we will continue on that theme and on that subject. Question first today is, what's it like to experience prophecy? I don't know, I never experienced it. However, I can tell you what has been brought down by our sages and by the Talmud, by the oral transmission, and in some of the writings of the prophecies. You know the word meshuggah? Have you ever heard the word Meshuggah? What does Meshuggah mean? Crazy. Do you know where the word Meshuggah is found? No. It comes from the description of the prophet during prophecy. It calls him Meshuggah. What does that mean? It looked from the outside that he was insane. That's where the word comes from. Where that means that, think about this transmission of a high megawatt signal coming to a low watt instrument. The low watt instrument can't contain the powerful energy that's coming in. If you're having a communication from the Almighty into a physical body, a physical human being, it can't contain it. And therefore, the body would be seemingly taken over by a spirit. And the individual had no control over their body. Yes, it would look like they were going through a seizure. They did not appear the way they normally appear. They did not function the way. It overloaded, we would call, the equipment of the human body. And there were spasms and there were seizures. Now, most of the prophecies, or many of the prophecies that we read about and talk about, didn't happen during daylight, where then we would see this occurrence take place where their body would go into this spasm-like effect. But it took place through dreams. And the dream is a lower form of prophecy in which they're getting a visual. They're watching the video. And in the visual, messages are being broadcast. In that sense, the body would be functioning as a body in sleep. We have strange dreams. We go through strange dreams, right? And when we wake up, we try to decipher if we remember them at all. I know it's a big subject for you, but we try to decipher what was the message. Is there a message? What was fantasy? The prophet, as we'll explain soon as we get into the subject of dreams and prophecies, would be given a communication during nighttime. So there was daytime prophecy, in which, as I mentioned, their body could not contain it in a regular, like, sane setting. So the observers called them Meshuggah, because they looked Meshuggah at the time. And then there were dream-like prophecies, which was the majority of them. There is an exception to this, and the exception was Moses. Moses was able, we'll talk more about this today, Moses was able to receive direct prophecy from God during daytime, not during dreamlike settings, and have a conversation. The only human being recorded to just have a regular conversation, as the Torah says, Peh el peh, I speak to Moses like a person speaks to the other. Yes, Jack.
A couple of comments, please. You're just overwhelming me.
Go ahead.
First, that letter. Could you send out the letters to all the email that letter just...
Sure.
I'm just overwhelmed. It's true. In our time, we've seen this. Herzl, after he came back from France, went to 2 weeks where he went Meshuggah. Mm-hmm. And that's what changed him from being secular to the man who created Israel. Young also went to a place when he was Meshuggah, and crazy things were happening to him. And that's when he discovered the law of the connection between all human beings at the collective level, which you were just discussing, mm-hmm. how the individual does receive information from the collective. Most of the time it's at an unconscious state.
Unconscious, yep. Next subject. Again, this is all part of an overview. Who were the prophets? When we talk about the prophets, who were they? So know this, there were thousands, tens of thousands of prophets in Jewish history. We also know that there were non-Jewish prophets. In the Torah, we talk about Bilam, who was a non-Jewish prophet, a very powerful portion filled with prophecies. The overwhelming majority of the prophets of our history, however, conveyed messages that were specific to that day, to that time, to that mission. Therefore, it was not recorded. You don't know of their names. You never heard of them. It was simply God emailing a message to someone through one of his prophets. He had a message to say that had to do with today, for that particular person, for that particular place. Those prophecies are not recorded. We have no written records of them, only that we knew that it was common. There were many, many prophets during the biblical times, during the times of the Jews, during the first temple era up until the second temple era. And as I told you last week, the criteria of becoming a prophet, all that the Maimonides listed of what it would mean, you were then a candidate for prophecy. So if God did want to deliver a message to someone, he could use you, didn't absolutely have. We spoke last week of how do you know if a prophet is true, how do you know if a prophet is a false prophet. We'll eventually come back to the subject of false prophecies later on, maybe next week or the week thereafter. But when we talk about the prophets, we're talking about a specific group. The Talmud will count 55 historical prophets whose prophecies are recorded in the Tanakh. Whether it's the Tanakh is the 5 books of Moses, or the books of the prophets, or the books of the writings. 55 of them. Those contain messages that were relevant to all generations. Those prophecies are on a different level. Because it wasn't just an individual prophet to an individual person in an individual hour. These were messages that need to have been studied throughout Jewish history. And we still read them. And we still try to understand them. Most of those 55 were public figures. They were leaders. Some of these names you're familiar with whether you studied their writings or not, but you've heard their names. If I said Samuel, you know there was a prophet named Samuel, one of the greatest prophets of Jewish history. He lived during the times of the anointing of King Saul and King David. You've heard of Isaiah. You've heard of Jeremiah, of Ezekiel, Amos, Hosea, Nahum. These are from that list of 55. Some have an entire book of their prophecies. You can read the book of Isaiah, the book of Ezekiel, an entire book. And you can spend weeks and months just on one book of one of these prophets. Some take up a very small section, perhaps a chapter, perhaps even a paragraph. But they're part of the biblical writings because that which they said needed to have been passed along. It wasn't just men. There were female prophetesses as well. The Torah will define Sarah as a prophet, Abraham's wife, as a prophet that was even greater than Abraham. That her level of prophecy was a higher level than Abraham's level of prophecy. That comes from the text of the Torah itself. Miriam, you've heard of. That was the sister of Moses, was a prophet. You've heard of Hannah. She was the mother of Samuel. She too was a prophet. Perhaps one of the latest prophets of Jewish history, known as one of the prophetesses, was Esther, Queen Esther of the story of Purim. We touched upon the subject last week, does prophecy exist today? And again, this is all just part of an overview on the subject. We can spend hours and hours on this subject, and perhaps later on in the semester we'll get back to it. The era of prophecy, when we talk about the era of prophecy, came to an end some 23 centuries ago. The last generation of prophets was those who began to prophesy during the first Holy Temple, during the destruction of the first Holy Temple, leading to the rebuilding of the Second Temple. So amongst those would be, you have Ezekiel who prophesies about Babylonia. You have Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. They were members of the Great Assembly that led the people in the first years of the return from Babylon. And then you have the story of Mordechai and Esther that bring the Jewish people back and are given permission from King Cyrus to rebuild the temple, and we have the second Holy Temple. That is the era during the beginning of the Second Temple era where the era of the prophecies stop. The latter part of the Second Temple did not have open prophecies, and once we were sent into exile Once the Romans came in and destroyed the temple, we no longer have that definitive prophet like an Ezekiel, like a Daniel. We don't have that. That era came to an end. Exile means something. Exile means more than just we don't have our land. Exile means we don't have our temple, we don't have the Beit HaMikdash. Exile is still more than that. It means Shchinta B'Galusa. It means the divine presence is in exile. You don't have open revelation. There is that distance. There is that gap now between us and God. It's not as close as it was. And what we try to do during the period of time of exile is lower that gap, lessen the gap, until once again we have that reuniting of God and His chosen people. It's the chosen people's mission to close that gap and bring us back to a period of time of revelation, of prophecy, of a Beit HaMikdash, of a holy temple. And that's a messianic period of time that we await for, that we long for, that we hope is very, very close. According to Jewish tradition, although prophecy as we know it of the books of the prophets, of those 55 that I mentioned, came to an end, there is still a communication that comes from God to mankind. We call it by the name Ruach HaKodesh. Anyone's ever heard of that terminology? Ruach HaKodesh means that the holy people, the tzaddikim, the real mystics and the holy people, are able to receive. It's not the level of prophecy of direct communication, but it's a Holy Spirit. That's the way we translate Ruach HaKodesh. A Holy Spirit means that their soul has senses. It feels things that the average person doesn't feel. So when you're in their presence, they have a sense of your soul. They know the past and the present and the future of your existence. Ruach HaKodesh also means they have a visual. They can see things in other parts of the world that's not right in front of them. Me and you, we're limited to our eyes. Or we're limited to where there's a camera and we can go on a website and see that camera. But other than that, we can't see it. They can. Their visual is not tied just to their physical eyes. Their visual comes through their soul as well. And the soul is not limited by the limitation of the eyes or the limitation of the body. They also have a sense of the heavenly world. So we're limited to what's going on here on this plane. They're not. And therefore, they have senses of what's going on in the heavenly world as well. That spirit of Ruach HaKodesh never left the Jewish people. We always had individuals that had that sense. We call them tzaddikim, we call them rebbes, we call them all different titles. But they were holy individuals that were able to lead and to inspire. They didn't stand up and say, I speak in the name of prophecy. They merely inspired us with their sense of what's going on. They inspired.
Is there someone today? Maybe?
I hope.
Bryski.
No. Don't undermine what it really is. The Rebbe clearly was that individual. No question about it. I mean, we've seen it, we saw it in public, we saw it in all the private meetings, the public meetings, the discussions. And I'll devote a class to some of that, where the Rebbe spoke openly and you're able to see as it was that prophetic, where you sensed it and you felt it. But Leia's question really is since the Rebbe passed away. I am sure there are. I don't believe the world can be without that sense of holiness. But I'd like to see them take center stage and speak up a little bit, especially in a period of time that we really can use that. If I can ask what I want to do, because we're also on the Zoom and YouTubes and Facebooks, and they can't hear your questions, so then they're just seeing a pause. So what I did last week was I finished my talk, and then we shut down the social media connections, and we were able to continue our discussion in the room. So if that's okay with you, we hold the questions in here, and then we'll give time for questions in the room. For those in Zoom land, you're going to miss out on that, and therefore next week, get into the room, get back. COVID is over, okay? It's time to come back. If you live out of the area, I get it, but if you live a few blocks away, we serve cookies and coffee before class, and Mirez makes a great lunch after class, so we invite you to come back. But again, if you're living in some other country, I did welcome the last time I spoke. The Jewish community of Uganda takes our classes now. We welcome all of them from Uganda. All those that are watching in all different parts of the world, or in Los Angeles, or New York, or New Zealand, wherever it may be, we welcome you that you join with us. According to tradition, one of the greatest prophets, Elijah, never died. So you're familiar with some of these traditions, right? Passover, you put a cup of Elijah. You open the door because Elijah is coming in. Elijah is still here with us. By every bris, there's a chair of Elijah. So Elijah is one of those prophets that we say his spirit in a very strong way remains with us in this world with us. There's this universal phenomenon about Elijah that his state of prophecy still remains with us. Mashiach himself is a prophet. That's what his main role will be. And it says that his level of prophecy will be similar to Moses. Well, God will be able to speak to him directly as he did with Moses. As it's written that it shall come to pass afterwards that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and daughters shall prophesy, your elders shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. So the prophecy concerning the time of Messiah is that prophecy in general will come back full force, where there will again be thousands upon thousands of prophets. We will be able to sense and feel the Spirit of God talk through us. In a famous letter to the Jews of Yemen, it's a powerful letter of its own, read what the letter was about, maybe again another time. But in that letter, Maimonides talks about prophecy, and Maimonides makes mention there the belief that the generation before the Messiah comes will already start experiencing prophecy. So it's not going to be that prophecy will start once the Messiah comes, but as it gets closer to Messiah, prophecy will start returning. I want to start on the subject of prophecy and dreams because that's what we said today's class is about. We didn't really get to all of it. We'll just start it. There is a verse in the book of Numbers, chapter 12, verse 6. And in that verse it says, if there should be prophets among you, in a vision shall I, God, make myself known to him. In a dream shall I speak with him. Remember I mentioned when we started, there was daytime prophecy, and then there was dream. And that comes from that verse where God says, I will make myself known to him is one sense of prophecy, and the other is, I will come to him in a dream. So there's established from the text of the Torah, and we have numerous verses where God uses the terminology, I will speak to him in a dream. When he speaks to Miriam and Aaron, when Miriam and Aaron said something negative about Moses, God comes to them and says, you're questioning Moses? And he says, all other prophets I come to in a dream. With Moses I speak to directly. So very clearly God tells us that he uses the dream-like state to communicate. In the book of Genesis, just the book of Genesis alone, there are 10 stories where dreams play a significant role. There's 10 different dreams talked about in the book of Genesis. As well, in addition, there's also a number of occurrences wherein highly significant events take place in a state of deep sleep. 10 dreams, 2 deep sleepers. I'll give you the 2 deep sleepers. We'll talk about it later, but I'll just tell you what they are. Adam goes into a deep sleep when God will take his side or his rib, however you translate it, and create Eve. It says he goes into a deep sleep. Abraham will go into a deep sleep when God will show him Jewish history. It was called the covenant between the parts, where he showed him the exiles that the Jewish people will have to suffer through, and he shows him the redemptions, the exodus, he shows him the messianic time as well. That was in a deep sleep, defined by the Torah, a deep sleep. Different than the other 10 dreams. Jacob was a dream. He's one of the 10 dreams. It uses the term deep sleep by those 2. The main, Adam and Eve. Adam goes into a deep sleep. The main theme that underlines all the dreams of the book of Genesis is that the notion of dreams are being either a channel of divine inspiration and prophecy, or the medium through which divine messages or signs are transmitted to the dreamer. But God is clearly using the dream as his form of prophecy. The Talmud makes a statement, which again, a lot of things that we're touching upon in this overview and that we're going to come back to at length. The Talmud says that a dream, and that means all of our dreams, the dreams you had last night are 1/60th of prophecy. That there is a little touch of it in every dream. Finding it, that's a challenge. But that it's there, it's there. It seemed to suggest that the very act of dreaming itself has a certain connection to prophecy. So that every single person really has some access to the upper worlds. We don't have it like Tzaddik has Ruach HaKodesh, but we do have that there's something coming to us. Obviously, it doesn't mean that when you have dreams that you're going to start every single morning figuring out every single part of that dream, because most of our dreams are fantasy. Most of our dreams is just the subconscious. Most of our dreams have something to do with something we experienced that day. It may be someone we spoke to that day. It may be something we saw on TV, something we heard, something that somehow floated into our subconscious or our conscious during the day that somehow in the night becomes part of a dreamlike state. But somewhere in that story, in that dream, there's something else there as well. The Talmud asserts clearly that many or most dreams are not prophetic in the general sense. So don't start every single day thinking, I'm a prophet because this is the dream I had. Be careful with it. But it does reinforce the idea that although the era of prophecy may have closed, there's still channels that God uses to send us messages. Okay, I'm going to start on my list of the 10 dreams of Genesis. We're just going to start today. We're going to continue this next week. The first dream that in the book of Genesis that the Torah says that God came to someone in a dream. Communication, direct communication you have early on in Genesis, right? God spoke to Adam and Eve right away. Don't eat from that tree. Why did you eat from the tree? So there's communication, God to a human being early on in the Bible. God spoke to Noah early on in the Bible. God spoke to Abraham early on. The first time that the Torah says, and God came to a human being in a dream, can anyone guess it? Not a Jew. Avimelech. Avimelech is the first one that the Torah will tell us that God came to him in a dream. Who was Avimelech? Avimelech was a king of a small country in Canaan called Gerar. And Abraham and Sarah will visit this place. The people there were immoral. As Abraham came to the borders of Gerar, he tells his wife Sarah, as he did when he traveled to Egypt, hey, let's be careful over here. Let's say that we're brothers and sisters. Don't say you're my wife, because then they'll kill me and take you. But if they think I'm your brother, I have a better chance of them being kind to us. Let's go with this fake out here, we'll say we're brother and sister. As they come into Gerar, it is told to the king that this woman has entered, and the king demands that Sarah be taken to the palace. He wants her. And he puts her in a chamber in the palace. And God comes to Avimelech in a dream. And he says, I will bring plagues upon you. You will suffer greatly, because you kidnapped this woman. In the dream, Avimelech responds to God. And Avimelech says to God, I didn't do anything wrong. Hey, they said they're brothers and sisters. Now, the response should be, and that's allowed, you're allowed to kidnap a woman if they're brothers and sisters. But God says to him, I know you haven't touched her yet. Don't. She's married. She's married to Abraham. And here's critical words of this dream. And I want you to know that he is a prophet. It's the first time the Torah uses that word. I want you to know that he's a prophet. And if he prays to me to ask for your forgiveness, I will heal you. Because he's a prophet. He could pray for your healing. The shocker of the story is Avimelech wakes up in the morning and he believes it. He doesn't say fantasy. He doesn't say, he calls all of his advisors together and says, that woman goes back to Abraham. We shower them with gifts. They're treated as honorable people. And then he has a discussion with Abraham and says, why did you lie to me? Why didn't you just tell me the truth? And Abraham explains to him morality is, I'm afraid of living amongst immoral people. It's the first time we have God communicating with a human being in a dream in great detail. It doesn't mean it's the first time it happened. It's the first time it's recorded. And we have details of this discussion that takes place in this dream. So it's interesting that it's the first communication of God in a dream to someone. Interesting. It's not even a Jew that he's talking to. Interesting that in there God uses the word prophecy for the first time, talking about, and Abraham is a prophet of God. Anyway, that's where we made through one of the 10. We'll continue next week. There's a lot to talk about on the subject of prophecies and dreams. I'm going to be signing out now from Zoom and Facebook and YouTube, and then we'll have a few minutes here to talk in the room. Take care, everyone else out there. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.